Study Section 4. Determination of Exchange Rate. Introduction. In the earlier chapter, we discussed the concept of exchange rate, types of exchange rate, and the participants in the foreign exchange market. In that chapter, we mentioned that interpretation of exchange rate is contingent on how it is being conceptualized. If we conceptualize exchange rate as quantity of domestic currency per unit of foreign currency, then an increase in exchange rate implies depreciation of domestic currency against the foreign currency in question. However, we did not answer some questions such as what determines exchange rate? Does exchange rate remain the same over time? Why may exchange rate rise or fall? What factors are responsible for increase and decrease in exchange rate? Exchange rate of Naira to dollar in the 1970s was around 70 kobo. In the 1980s, the rate rose to 22 Naira, and by 2009, the official exchange rate was around 149 Naira on average. What causes this variation in exchange over time? In this chapter, we shall review a simple model of exchange rate determination and use it to tackle some of the questions highlighted earlier. Later, we shall introduce a relatively complex model of exchange rate determination. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you are expected to do the following. Understand the role of demand and supply in the determination of spot exchange rate. Understand other factors that determine exchange rate. Identify the users and suppliers of foreign exchange. Recognize and master some exchange rate regimes, and examine the determination of forward exchange rate. Demand for foreign exchange. The demand for any currency such as Naira in the foreign exchange market is a derived demand. This is because a currency is not demanded for its own sake, but for what it can buy. Thus, it is important to bear it in mind that the essence of demanding for foreign exchange is for the purpose of engaging in transactions denominated in foreign currencies. We have known that the exchange rate is measured as the price of domestic currency per unit of foreign currency. Thus, to illustrate the demand for Naira with respect to changes in exchange rate, Table 4.1 presents a hypothetical demand for exchange rate table. We assume that Nigeria and Ghana are the two trading partners. We assume that as exchange rate rises to 40 Naira per cedi, an equivalent of 0.025 cedi per Naira, 300 instead of 100 barrels of crude oil was bought, and the total Naira demanded for by the Ghanaian resident rose from 10,000 to 30,000. The equivalent dollar amount supply will be 0.025 times 20,000, which is equal to $500. When the exchange rate rose from 40 to 50 in the third period, implying that cedi is now 0.02 per unit of Naira, Nigerian crude oil became cheaper, and hence demand rose from 200 to 450, and this causes an increase in the demand for Naira from 20,000 to 45,000. An equivalent of 900 cedi. This table therefore shows that as Naira depreciates against cedi, or as cedi appreciates against Naira, demand for Naira by the Ghanaian importer is increasing. Thus, there is a negative relationship between exchange rate cedi to Naira and demand for Naira. This is graphically shown in Figure 4.1. In this simple schedule, the price elasticity of demand for Naira depends on the price elasticity of demand for Naira's export. If the Ghanaian demand for Naira export is inelastic, this means that an appreciation of cedi will lead to a relatively small increase in the demand for Naira exports, and hence a relatively small increase in the demand for Naira. Therefore, the demand for foreign exchange is more inelastic. The more inelastic is the foreign import demand, and hence the more inelastic the demand for foreign currency. The graph shows that there is a negative relationship between exchange rate and demand for foreign currency. An increase in exchange rate cedi to Naira implies appreciation of Naira against cedi, and therefore leads to decrease in export demand. decrease in export demand will be associated with decrease in the demand for naira. Conversely, a decrease in exchange rate cedi to naira implies depreciation, and this leads to increase in the demand for exports, which will be associated with increase in the demand for naira. Most importantly, any factor that affects export demand will affect demand for naira, while changes in exchange rate lead to movement along the demand curve. A change in any other factor that causes either decrease or increase in the demand for export, and hence demand for naira, will lead to a parallel shift of the demand curve. Other factors that can affect demand for export include trading partners' income, taste, and the domestic and or foreign price level. Holding exchange rate constant, an increase in the Ghanaian income, according to the table above, is expected to increase demand for naira's export, which will lead to increase in the demand for naira. Increased demand for naira's export, which will lead to increase in the demand for naira. This effect will lead to a rightward shift of the demand curve. An increase in the general price level in the Ghanaian will lead to a fall in the demand for Nigeria export, and hence reduces demand for naira. In this case, demand curve will shift inwards. Note that a change in any of these factors will shift supply schedule parallel to itself if exchange rate is held constant. A close inspection of the demand for and supply of foreign exchange currency shows that the condition of the domestic economy determines supply of domestic currency for the purchase of foreign goods. If the economy is buoyant, we expect import to rise, and this leads to increase in the supply of currency. If the economy is in recession, downturn, import is expected to fall and supply of naira shrinks. Also, if the economy is suffering from persistent inflation, imports are expected to fall and hence supply of currency. Thus, it is the condition performance of the domestic economy that dictates import condition. That is, domestic economy has control over import while foreign economy does not. Conversely, the demand for foreign currency is determined by the situation in the foreign countries. If foreign economies are buoyant or the price level falls, perhaps due to increase in productivity of labor, this will lead to increase in the demand for the trading partners' export. Alternatively, if foreign economies are suffering from recession, export demand falls, and this leads to reduction in the demand for domestic currency. A good example of the above is the recent global financial crisis that led to economic recession in Nigeria's major trading partners, economies like the US, the UK, and Canada. During the financial crisis, which led to economic recession, is complete. Nigerians' exports, both oil and non-oil, fell considerably, and demand for naira fell during this period. The point we are trying to make here is that Nigeria, or the domestic economy, does not have any control over its export demand. Foreign economies dictate to a large extent the tune of export demand. Equilibrium spot exchange rate. Since foreign exchange market is a market which brings together people that wish to buy demand currencies with those that wish to sell supply currencies, therefore spot exchange rate can be thought of as being determined by the interaction of the supply of and demand for currencies. Figure 4.3 shows the determination of equilibrium spot exchange rate. In the context of this framework, the equilibrium or market spot exchange rate is determined by the intersection of the supply and demand curves. Combination of figures 4.1 and 4.2. The figure shows that equilibrium spot exchange rate is 0.025 in terms of unit of cedi to naira, or 40 in terms of unit of naira to cedi. At this equilibrium, spot exchange rate 20,000 naira is demanded for while the same amount is supplied. Factors responsible for changes in spot exchange rate. Note that if any of the factors discussed earlier changes, there will be disequilibrium because it is either supply of the currency is more than demand for it, or the other way around. Thus, to restore equilibrium, exchange rate has to adjust upward or downward depending on the shift of the curves. For instance, suppose US income increases, ceteris paribus, more of Nigerians' export products will be demanded for, and so more naira is expected as payment in cedis translates to more local currency. The demanded for, so that the demand curve shifts rightwards. Figure 4.4 shows that to restore equilibrium, exchange rate has to rise, naira appreciating against dollars while currency demanded also increases. We see that increase in the demand for naira due to increase in income of the US drives exchange rate up, settling at $0.05 per unit of naira. When forces of demand and supply of currency determine exchange rate, it is called flexible exchange rate. Meanwhile, it is not in all cases that exchange rates respond either partially or fully to changes in demand and supply conditions. For instance, the above example shows that as income rises in the US, more Nigeria export is demanded for, and even demand schedule, exchange rate rises. That is, in our example, naira appreciates the more. The authority may not like such appreciation to occur, perhaps due to its negative implications like inducing more imports on the balance of payment, which we shall discuss at length later in the course. As a result, there are other exchange rate regimes that countries use. We discuss these regimes in what follows. Alternative exchange rate regime. The forces of demand and supply may not change the position of the exchange rate if the authority fixes it. Fixed exchange rate was practiced by virtually all countries of the world between 1948 and 1973. The adoption of fixed exchange rate was agreed upon in the 1948 Bretton Woods Conference. During this period, each currency was fixed against the dollars. But with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system at the end of 1973, each country was allowed to adopt any suitable regime. Some countries chose floating exchange rate, some chose fixed exchange rate, while others, some chose combination of floating and pegged. In the case of developing countries, particularly Africa, series of exchange rate regimes like crawling peg, managed floating, etc. were adopted. What is fixed exchange rate regime? What differentiates it from floating exchange rate? How does the authority fix exchange rate? The floating exchange rate regime. When a country adopts floating exchange rate regime, authorities government do not intervene to buy or sell currencies in the foreign exchange market. That is, they allow exchange rate to respond fully to the fluctuations in the supply and demand for currencies. Figure 4.5 shows how floating exchange rate regime operates. Suppose the initial equilibrium position is at point E. At this point, the amount of naira clears the foreign exchange market and the exchange rate consistent with that equilibrium quantity Q1 of naira is R⁻⁴. Suppose that foreign demand for naira's export increase, this will shift demand curve to the right and Q² amount of naira will be demanded for. As we can see, this leads to increase in exchange rate, appreciation of naira against dollar. It follows that if a country adopts completely floating exchange rate, any factor that increases export demand will result to appreciation of the exchange rate. Note the way we define exchange rate here. Suppose something happens abroad that leads to decrease in the demand for Nigerian export, like global financial crisis that transpired to global economic recession. This will shift demand inwards so that less quantity of naira will be demanded for. As seen on the graph, reduction in demand for naira will reduce exchange rate, dollar to naira, and so naira will depreciate against dollar. Generally, any factor that reduces domestic export will lead to depreciation of the domestic currency if the country adopts floating exchange rate. Exchange rate can also be affected by supply of currency. Note that any factor that changes import demand will shift the supply curve. Figure 4.6 shows a case of increase. in import demand, perhaps due to increase in income. The graph shows that if import demand rises, supply of naira will increase, and so supply curve shifts downwards and to the right. This being the case, exchange rate will fall from R to R raised to power 1, so that the effect of increase in import demand will lead to depreciation of naira. This implies that any factor that increases import demand will lead to depreciation of the currency of the importing country against that of the exporting country, while any factor that causes decrease in import demand will lead to appreciation of the importing country against the exporting country. Thus, under the regime, floating exchange rate adjusts in response to changes in the supply of and demand for currency, and it leads to appreciation or depreciation of the currency. Fixed exchange rate regime. When a country adopts fixed exchange rate regime, the authorities government play a vital role by buying or selling domestic currency to prevent it from appreciating or depreciating against foreign currencies. Suppose dollar to naira is fixed at R raised to power 1 in figure 4.7, and suppose that the demand for Nigerian's export rises so that the demand curve shifts to the right since more naira will be demanded. But if there is no intervention, we expect Nigerian's currency to appreciate. If the authorities want to keep peg exchange rate at R raised to power 1, that is, to prevent appreciation of naira, they will have to supply Q raised to power 1 minus Q raised to power 2 amount of naira and purchase CD. Sale of naira means supply of naira, and as more naira is supplied, naira begins to depreciate, thereby neutralizing the appreciating effect of increased demand. The purchase of domestic currency, naira shifts supply curve to the right and downwards to produce S raised to power 2. Implication of this type of intervention is that first, it weakens the power of naira, leading to more export demand, and 2, it increases the amount of naira in circulation, which may then lead to inflation. The authorities can also intervene from demand side. Suppose that import demand rises such that foreign exchange supply curve shifts to the right, there will be excess supply of money at the going exchange rate, and this will mount downward pressure on exchange rate, leading to depreciation of naira. To prevent depreciation, CBN will intervene by mopping up excess naira liquidity in the system. This mopping is done through the purchase of Q1 minus Q raised to power 2 amount of naira with equivalent dollar. There is an important question arising from this arrangement, that is, where will the authority get money to buy or sell dollar? The money will be got from the foreign reserve. Recall that foreign reserve is the country's amount of other currencies kept in the treasury of International Monetary Institutions (IMF). Foreign reserves serve many purposes, like serving to pay external debt, used for investment in foreign countries, converted to domestic currency, and can also be used to purchase imported goods and services. Thus, when the authority is selling naira, it must be buying dollar or foreign currency. When the authority is buying naira, it must be selling dollar, foreign currency. When the authority is buying naira and selling dollar, it is reducing the foreign reserve of the country at the expense of excess supply. When the authority is buying dollar, foreign currency, and selling naira, it is increasing foreign reserve at the expense of too little money in the economy. Thus, when the authority maintains fixed exchange rate, any increase in export will lead to building up foreign reserve, while any increase in import will lead to drawing down the foreign reserve. In general, when a country adopts fixed pegged exchange rate, it must be ready to buy or sell its domestic currency as the case may be. Selling domestic currency to buy foreign currency is targeted at preventing appreciation of the domestic currency, and such intervention increases foreign reserve and also increases money in circulation. If the authority buys domestic currency to sell foreign currency, the intention was to prevent exchange rate depreciation. Such intervention deteriorates foreign reserves and also freezes money in circulation. managed floating exchange rate regime. The industrial nations adopted managed floating exchange rate regime in 1973 following the breakdown of the international monetary system based on fixed rates. Because of defects in the decision-making process caused by procedural difficulties and political biases, however, adjustments of par values under the Bretton Woods system were often delayed and discontinuous. It was recognized that exchange rates should be adjusted more promptly and in small but continuous amounts in response to evolving market forces. In 1973, a managed floating system was adopted, under which informal guidelines were established by the IMF for coordination of national exchange rate policies. The motivation for the formulation of guidelines for floating arose from two concerns. The first was that nations might intervene in the exchange markets to avoid exchange rate alterations that would weaken their competitive position. When the United States suspended its gold convertibility pledge and allowed its overvalued dollar to float in the exchange market, it hoped that a free market adjustment would result in a depreciation of the dollar against other undervalued currencies. Rather than permitting a clean float, a market solution to occur, foreign central banks refused to permit the dollar depreciation by intervening in the exchange market. The United States considered this a dirty float because the free market forces of supply and demand were not allowed to achieve their equilibrating role. A second motivation for guidelines was a concern that float over time might lead to disorderly market with erratic fluctuations in exchange rates. Such destabilizing activity could create an uncertain business climate and reduce the level of world trade. Under managed floating, a nation can alter the degree to which it intervenes on the foreign exchange market. Heavier intervention moves the nation nearer the fixed exchange rate case, whereas less intervention moves the nation nearer the floating exchange rate case. Concerning day-to-day and week-to-week exchange rate movement, a main objective of the floating guidelines has been to prevent the emergence of erratic fluctuations. Member nations should intervene on the foreign exchange market as necessary to prevent sharp and disruptive exchange rate fluctuations from day to day and week to week. Such a policy is known as lending against the wind, intervening to reduce short-term fluctuations in exchange rate without attempting to adhere to any particular rate over the long run. Members should also not act aggressively with respect to their currency exchange rates. That is, they should not enhance the value when it is appreciating or depress the value when it is depreciating. Crawling peg exchange rate. Instead of adopting fixed or floating rates, why not try a compromise approach? The crawling peg. This system has been used by nations including Bolivia, Brazil, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Solomon Island, and Peru. The crawling peg system means that a nation makes a small frequent changes in the par value of its currency to correct balance of payments disequilibria. Deficit and surplus nations both keep adjusting until the desired exchange rate level is attained. The term crawling peg implies that par value changes are implemented in a large number of small steps, making the prices of exchange rate adjustment continuous for all practical purposes. The peg thus crawls from one par value to another. The crawling peg mechanism has been used primarily by nations having high inflation rates. Some developing nations, mostly South American, have recognized that a pegging system can operate in an inflationary environment only if there is provision for frequent changes in the par values. Associating national inflation rate with international competitiveness, these nations have generally used price indicators as a basis for adjusting crawling pegged rates. In these nations, the primary concern is the criterion that governs exchange rate movement rather than the currency or basket of currencies against which the peg is defined. The crawling peg differs from the system of adjustable peg rates. Under the adjustable peg, currencies are tied to a par value that changes infrequently, perhaps once every several years, but suddenly, usually in large jumps. The idea behind the crawling peg is that a nation can make small frequent changes in par values, perhaps several times a year, so that they creep along slowly in response to evolving market conditions. Supporters of the crawling peg argue that the system combines the flexibility of floating rate with the stability usually associated with fixed rates. They contend that a system providing continuous, steady adjustment is more responsive to changing competitive conditions and avoids a main problem of adjustable pegged rate that changes in par values are frequently wide of the mark. Moreover, small frequent changes in par values made at random intervals frustrate speculators with their irregularity. In recent years, the crawling peg formula has been used by developing nations facing rapid and persistent inflation. However, the IMF has generally contended that such a system would not be in the best interest of nations such as the United States or Germany, which bear the responsibility for international currency levels. The IMF has felt that it would be hard to apply such a system to the industrialized nations, whose currencies serve as a source of international liquidity. Although even the most ardent proponents of the crawling peg admit that the time for its widespread adoption has not yet come, the debate over its potential merit is bound to continue. Determination of forward exchange rate. Thus far, we have discussed how spot exchange rate is being determined. We now discuss how forward exchange rate is being determined. Recall that forward exchange market is a market where buyers and sellers agree to exchange currencies at some specific date in which the delivery will take place in the future. For instance, a Nigeria trader who has to pay $10,000 to his US supplier of jeans at the end of, say, December may decide on 1st of October to buy $10,000 for delivery on 31st December of the same year at a 3-month forward exchange rate of, say, 10 naira per dollar. But why should a trader wish to agree today to exchange currency at some specified time in future? To answer this question, we shall discuss the operations of the participant in the forward exchange rate market. Participants in the foreign exchange market are classified into 3: the hedgers, the arbitrageurs, and the speculators. The hedgers. These are agents in the foreign exchange market with the motive of protecting themselves against exchange rate fluctuations or exchange rate risk. Exchange rate risk is a risk of loss associated with unfavorable. An example of how hedgers work is illustrated as follows. Suppose a Nigerian businessman who uses to import Italian shoes from Italy is due to pay for goods worth 4,100 euro in 3 months' time. Exchange rate movement. Assuming that the spot exchange rate is 200 naira per euro, while the forward exchange rate is 190 naira per euro. If the importer buys euro forward at 190 naira per euro, he will pay 779,000 naira if he did not buy forward today. If the spot exchange rate in 3 months' time is, say, 201 naira per euro, a depreciation of naira against euro, then he will have to pay 861,000 naira, 210 times 4,100, implying that the importer will pay more in 3 months' time, an excess of 82,000. However, spot exchange rate in 3 months' time may be favorable, in which case the spot exchange rate may be something like 170 naira per euro, an appreciation of naira against euro. This means that the importer will only have to pay 697,000 naira and gain 82,000 naira. In a case like this, it pays to settle the payment at spot rate, whereas in the first example, depreciation, it doesn't pay to pay at spot. By engaging in forward exchange contracts, the trader can be sure of the amount of naira he will have to pay for the import. Thus, he protects himself against the risk involved in exchange rate fluctuation. But why should the businessman engage in forward contracts and not immediately when the exchange rate was 200? First, it may be the case that the importer does not have enough money at the period of the contract. Where the over P means discount or premium, the presence of arbitrageurs ensures that what is known as covered interest rate parity (CIP) condition holds continually. The CIP condition is a formula used by commercial banks to compute their forward exchange rate quotation. Assuming that 1 year forward exchange rate is F, 1 year spot exchange rate is S, annual domestic and foreign interest rates are I and I** respectively. Then, to calculate 3-month forward exchange rate, we have to divide the annual interest rate by 4. Let us compute a forward exchange rate. By the following example, suppose that the 1-year Nigerian Naira interest rate is 7%, while the US dollar interest rate is 5%, and the spot exchange rate of Naira to dollar is 130 Naira per dollar. The 1-year forward exchange rate using equation 4.2 is: to find out whether Naira is forward discount or forward premium, we use the newly computed forward exchange rate in equation 4.1. The 1-year forward exchange rate of Naira is at forward discount of minus 1.87%. Now it is easy to approximate equation 4.2 to I** minus I, which is the generalized version of CIP condition, GCIP. This approximation is essentially the interest rate differential that commercial banks use. The GCIP condition says that if the domestic interest rate is higher than the foreign interest rate, then the domestic currency will be at forward discount by an equivalent percentage. Note that the difference between Nigeria and the US interest rate is 2%, and the computation of forward discount is also approximately 2%. Thus, the interest rate differential is enough to show the discount premium. Speculators. They are agents that make profit by anticipating and accepting exchange rate risk. They engage in forward exchange rate business because of the belief that there will be difference between the quoted forward exchange rate and the spot exchange rate that will prevail at the point of delivery. Assuming that the quoted 1-year forward exchange rate is 127 per dollar, and suppose that the speculators suspect that the spot rate will be, say, 125 per dollar in 1 year time, he may sell $100 forward at 127 per dollar to obtain 12,700 and hope to change the Naira back to dollar in 1 year's time at 125 per dollar in obtain $101.6 and make $1.6 profit. However, it is also possible for the speculator to make wrong guesses about the spot exchange rate. 12,700 over 125 is equal to 101.6. 101.6 minus 100 is equal to 1.6. For instance, the 1-year spot exchange may be 130 per dollar. In this case, $12,700 will only worth $97.7, which means that the speculator will lose $2.3 due to wrong guesses. Thus, speculators are open to risk of exchange rate depreciation or appreciation. If the speculator expects exchange rate to appreciate in the future, it pays to sell foreign currency now and buy back later. If exchange rate is expected to depreciate in the future, it pays to buy foreign currency now and sell in the future. Wrong guesses can squeeze away the profit opportunities of speculators. Study section summary. Demand for a currency is derived demand, that is, for the purpose of import, is determined by macroeconomic conditions and performance such as national income, price level, and the taste for domestic products. Exchange rate is inversely related to demand for domestic currency by the foreign consumers. Supply of domestic currency is positively related to exchange rate. Domestic macroeconomic performance such as national income, price level, and taste, which determines demand for import, are also drivers of supply of domestic currency. The forces of demand and supply of domestic currency establishes equilibrium spot exchange rate. There are many exchange rate regimes, but the two extremes are floating and fixed exchange rate regimes. Under the floating exchange rate regime, the authorities allow forces of demand and supply to determine the market-going exchange rate. In this case, exchange rate can depreciate or appreciate depending on market condition of demand and supply. In this case of fixed exchange rate, authorities intervene to prevent depreciation or appreciation of exchange rate. If the authority maintains a given exchange rate, increase in the demand for domestic currency due to increase in export must be matched with sales of domestic currency and purchase of foreign currency. Otherwise, there will be depreciation of exchange rate. To prevent this, the authority will intervene by purchasing domestic currency with foreign exchange reserve. Forward exchange rate is determined by the participant in forward exchange market. While hedgers tend to protect themselves against risk, speculators open up to risk and arbitrageurs look for how to exploit exchange rate differentials in various markets or centers and avoid risk arising from exchange rate fluctuation. This is the end of study section 4. Thanks for listening.